Hi, I'm Gabe Filippelli, a professor and executive director of the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute. And this is season 6 of The Collective Tap, brought to you by the White River Alliance and podcasting from beautiful Fountain Square in Indianapolis. This is the first episode of season 6, and we're jumping right into the fray with maybe the most controversial and relevant issue related with water in Indiana at the moment, and the landscape these days in general, data centers. Data centers are known to pose multiple threats across a broad spectrum, but if we just focus on the narrow view of water, we'll see concerns about water quantity and quality, right? So the amount of water and the quality of water and contamination that supplies not just us, but we have to remember what we rotate around on this beautiful globe with our friends, the birds, the bees, the trees. In this episode, we're going to dive into these questions about water resources and how to manage them better in the face of data center growth with two people who have spent a lot of time examining the issue. Dr. Maria Iturbide-Chang is an environmental executive with more than 30 years of experience in integrated water resources management, environmental research, and science-based policy across North America and Latin America. She's the founder of CONFLUENCE Insights, a platform connecting science, policy, and practice. We're going to hear more about that, I'm sure. And currently serves as on the board of directors of America's Watershed Initiative and the UN Water Strategic Advisory Group. Ben Inskeep is program director at Citizens Action Coalition, and my favorite social media follow for his really insightful views on a number of things, but his focus lately on data centers, bringing some actual math to some of these issues. He's the Citizens Action Coalition is an Indiana-based consumer environmental advocacy organization. At that organization, Ben works to hold Indiana utilities and other large polluters accountable and protect Hoosier taxpayers, ratepayers from the growing affordability crisis, which we're all actually quite concerned about. Maria and Ben, welcome to the Collective Tap.
Thank you.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Fantastic. As promised, we're going to dive right into things. So I think it's really important to set the stage. So when most people, they hear about data centers, and we've seen communities respond typically in the negative about data centers, but we need to understand where they sit in the context of Indiana and even the country. And so I'm going to start with you, Ben, setting the stage with data. I consider you're not just a data guy, but you kind of are a data guy. So there's a number of issues related to data centers. I'm going to focus on a couple of these first. First, I want to dispel one thing, get it out of the way. You are an expert also on electrical demands of data centers and how they manage that. What in your words, what is is there a nexus between the water and the electricity that we should be thinking about?
Absolutely. There is a close nexus, just like in other areas of water and energy. There's a nexus here with data centers as well. Particularly with data centers, you're talking about the largest electric users on the grid. We're talking facilities that use hundreds, if not potentially thousands of megawatts of power, more than a steel mill, more than an aluminum smelter. So we're talking about very large users of energy. With that large energy consumption comes indirect water impact associated with these facilities, because a lot of the electricity generation in our country uses a tremendous amount of water. So I'm talking about coal plants, nuclear plants, natural gas plants. They all can withdraw tens of millions of gallons of water per day as part of their cooling process and part of generating electricity. So data centers that use a lot of electricity are going to have a large indirect water impact through that very mechanism. So that's just one example of how these topics are interrelated. We can get into the cooling systems and how they can also have this kind of trade-off between energy and water as well. But there are definitely areas that are overlapping and are important for our resources, not just water, but on energy side as well.
Oh, great. Yeah, we will geek out a little bit on some of these topics. It's really important. Maria, do you have a perspective on that energy-water nexus?
Yes, and it's interesting because we always think about that difference, energy one side and water the other side, but they are really interconnected. And of course, as you just explained, we need water in order to have energy. Mm-hmm. And when we think about the cooling systems, even though there is innovation in technology, that technology uses energy, and that's more water as well.
Excellent points. Yeah. Ben, why Indiana? Why now? What's the deal?
Yeah, Indiana has not been a historic state for a lot of data centers. We do have a few dozen. These are relatively small data centers in existence today. But what we're seeing is really an avalanche of very large data center proposals. We're talking several orders of magnitude larger in size in terms of the footprint, the number of acres, the energy consumption, water consumption, and so on. So Indiana is getting hit with this avalanche. We're becoming one of the leaders in terms of being an emerging market for data centers because of a confluence of several factors. Indiana has the existing infrastructure, things like very high voltage transmission lines, fiber optic cables. We have access to water in many parts of the state that they need. We have low cost land, labor, business taxes, that kind of thing that creates the business environment for a company to want to be here. But definitely the subsidies are a key issue. Indiana offers an astronomical amount of subsidies to these data centers that are coming here. So one data center can get a 50-year sales tax exemption worth multi-billion dollars. They can also get property tax abatements at the local government level, also potentially worth multi-billion dollars per data center. So that's a very lucrative environment. It creates a very favorable setting. And then when you add to the fact that Indiana kind of historically has had a situation where we've had regulatory and legislative capture by special interests, large industrial users, commercial users, it makes it so maybe there's a track record of our government being susceptible to passing policies and regulations that are favorable to these very large interests, and oftentimes, at the expense or detriment of the folks that live here in Indiana.
Okay. And what about, do we have those same kind of policies around water? I'm going to ask you, Maria, if you're aware, if we have the same kind of policy framework, which is makes it the Wild West for data centers out here.
Yes, and there was an executive order that Governor Brown established last year regarding a water inventory. So that as well comes into what's next. With that inventory, I know it's going to provide a good information, but is that information going to be used to open up the doors to more infrastructure coming to the state, or that inventory will mean, okay, we're going to think strategically and we are going to create a management plan. So we think about infrastructure coming to the state, but as well for the communities and the people that we live and depend on them.
Right. And that's an excellent point. We're going to get into a little bit later into the fact that water is inherently a local resource, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Electricity, maybe not so much. It is somewhat, but water has more restrictions. Now, one of the things I want to make clear for the people who are watching and listening is that the fiber lines, the power transmission lines, they're concentrated in certain areas in the state, right? That's why you don't see a lot of proposals in areas of the state that don't have that infrastructure, right?
That's right. Yeah, there are certain areas that have the high voltage transmission lines going through them. For example, data centers are going to want to be able to tap right into those high voltage transmission lines, get a lot of power, have high reliability. You can plug in and start building your data center and have that reliability. So yes, there are specific areas that maybe are more attractive to the data centers, and they're targeting those spots on the grid, or where they can get this infrastructure built quickly, because for many of them, the name of the game is speed. They want to build quickly. They want to get access to power. They're looking to get market share as generative AI takes off. So they're really concerned about speed above all else, which is why they're targeting some of these specific areas that have that existing baseline infrastructure that's going to give them a head start.
No, that makes a lot of sense. In Indiana, where it sits, kind of in the crossroads of things, as it were. I mean, that's all well and good with, let's say, the transmission lines for electricity, as well as the fiber lines to get data back, to and from, I suppose. But we don't have that luxury with water, do we, Maria? Tell me a little bit. I want to dive into the water as local concept.
Absolutely. And when we think about these kind of developments and infrastructure, it's not about just water. It's all the ecosystem services that this infrastructure will destroy. So if we think about just water, for example, we know that the Indiana region has very different geology, and that also has to do with the recharge rates as well.
Explain recharge rates to people.
Yeah, so of course, because of the difference in geology, we know there are regions in the country, in the state, in which water recharges faster because of the geology, and areas in which the water can move, like a drop of water can move a foot between years and even decades.
Okay.
So if we destroy the land, and comparing an infrastructure development with agricultural land, with the agriculture, water still recharges. But when we are converting this land with permeable, impermeable concrete, that we are not recharging the water recharge. So that's the problem when this infrastructure comes into town.
So it's sort of like a bank budget, right? That your rate of withdrawal should more or less equal your rate of deposit. If you want to think of the aquifer, which is the storage area for water in the subsurface, which a lot of these data centers and the municipalities that they're from, that's where they tend to be drawing from, right?
And not just the municipalities, they are private wells as well.
Oh, yeah.
And we are all withdrawing from the same aquifer. But as I mentioned, agricultural land still recharges. But when we convert this land with concrete, we stop the recharge. And we are adding that pressure to the withdrawal system. So it's a lot of factors.
Yeah, and when you don't have deposits anymore, you'll notice your bank account going
Absolutely.
down. Ben, you already you answered a couple of these questions, but I'm going to dive into a little bit more detail with one of them. One of them is, are data centers new? The answer is no, but
yes, they're not new, but the type of data center, the scale of the data center, and the pace of them coming is completely unprecedented, completely unsustainable, and just orders of magnitude larger in the impacts. So that's why it's become reached a crisis point, if you will, where these impacts are truly astronomical and unprecedented. So these create a lot of concerns. We were talking about the water consumption offsite from their power consumption, but these things, of course, use a lot of water on site for at least many of them that are using some of the less water efficient cooling methods. Data centers, since they're taking all this massive amounts of electricity, that electricity is being converted into heat, essentially, in the servers. That's a waste heat. And so the data centers are, these large data centers are having to get rid of that waste heat, get it out of the building, away from the servers, so it's not destroying this, electrical equipment. And that's where these water cooling systems come into play that can use tremendous amounts of water. So that's, I think, probably one of the issues that I think is galvanizing a lot of concern from the public in all corners of our states, of our state, because we have definitely concerns about water poor areas of our state, or areas of the state that do not have ample additional water to meet a very large new consumer of that water.
So what you said was exactly right. We're taking heat from the chips that need to be cooled, like that's why your laptop and desktop have fans on them, right? Their performance starts degrading when they got hot. Yeah. And are we doing it like a car where we're recirculating the cooling system? No, I want to get into technology a little bit later, but no, we're largely taking that heat and dumping it as trash, harmful trash, right? Hot water is not good for the ecology. Most ecologists put in. That's a resource. We're throwing away a valuable resource because the data centers don't need to. They don't need to balance that in the budget sheets, right? So put a pin in that. We'll get there. And also, just to make it clear, will you guys both agree with the statement that data centers are not job producers?
Absolutely.
It's a complicated question. I would say there's short-term construction jobs, there's a few long-term permanent jobs on site, but then there's these indirect impacts. This is all to create a technology, generative AI, that the companies building them are saying are going to eliminate jobs. So it's all to reduce employment at the end of the day. So yes, there's some jobs created. Who knows how many are being destroyed? There's not going to be a conservation here. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty. But at the end of the day, I think these are not big job creators. They're not going to be like a big manufacturing site.
Right.
That's coming into play, that's bringing 1,000 jobs, 2,000 jobs. It's not going to be that kind of a situation.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly not for the communities where they're built in, right?
Exactly.
They might get a handful of jobs out of it.
And all too often we're seeing a lot of the short-term construction jobs are people coming from out of state to do these jobs. So many times it's not even benefiting the host state or host community because they're bringing in labor from out of that location.
Oh, that's interesting. Probably because they're crews that know how they built one somewhere else. And
there are crews that travel all across the country doing their one thing they're good at data centers as they get constructed.
So, Maria, the Alliance for the Great Lakes has produced, meaning you, produced the Data Center Playbook for Communities, co-authored by you and Helena Volser. What guidance does it offer? What inspired you to do that, and what does it do?
So in 2025, August 2025, the FINAT resource report was launched. And that report talked about data centers, manufacturing, and agricultural. So it was large water users and the impact that those large water users were bringing to the Great Lakes. When that report was published, there were a lot of communities and stakeholders calling the Alliance as they needed guidance or on what to do, what questions to ask, when was the right timing to intervene. So we created that playbook as a way to answer those questions. So the Alliance for the Great Lakes is a regional organization. And what we did, we brought the toolkits that many states have developed. So we created just one comprehensive playbook in which we tried to help and created this checklist to help communities, local governments to ask the right questions at the right time. So that's the main idea of this playbook, to just provide several questions, key questions regarding water, regarding energy, regarding job descriptions and jobs and all the promises these infrastructures made when they come to a region, right? So that's the idea of this playbook, to guide communities and local governments to ask the right questions at the right time.
So let me ask the process then. I'm going to ask it for you and then for Ben. You guys might be looking at it from different kind of perspectives. So I'm put on either hat you want, or put on both. I am a city council member and I have a big data center that said, hey, I'm going to bring X, Y, and Z. I'm going to bring you the moon and the stars. All you need to do is sign away, your your rights and your taxes for a long time, and we're going to build this thing. And then there's a community member hearing other people in other parts of the state and the country being concerned about these in the backyard. What if I am a city council person really trying to use data to influence my decisions so that I can look to the community member and say, I did what's best for the community? What kind of data do they need? When do they need it, by the way? I love that fact. When do they need it?
So water availability, first of all, is our region has the available water in order to supply and sustain long-term withdrawals, not just for these facilities, but for the community and other facilities as well that are already in the region. So that will be my first question to guide the local council. Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the energy infrastructure as well? What are the benefits this infrastructure are bringing to our communities? And also the reporting. I think the reporting and the transparency is a key element. And that's something that is missing in all the data centers, the non-disclosure agreement they sign. So that's a lot of secrecy. So I will suggest, there is a standard that we need to implement in the region according to water usage and water discharge as well. We need to know what's going in the water when they are discharging these resources as well. So those will be my key element questions to ask.
Those are the top ones,
yes.
The top data. Ben, do you share that? Are those, what other ones might you be thinking about?
Yeah, those are critical questions and great points about how often these data centers do not provide that transparency up front because they're entering into these non-disclosure agreements and oftentimes not telling communities up front about their ultimate plans. Sometimes you see data centers roll out in phases. And so they come in the community and say, oh, it's only going to be one building. And then, a year later you find out, oh, there's a second building and then there's going to be a third building and then maybe 10 more buildings. And so, at the end of the day, you're really wanting to know in advance, what's their site plan, have a clear site plan, know how big this development could be. What are those energy needs? How are those going to be met? Oftentimes utilities don't know at the time. And so that's often a question mark of where's that energy going to be coming from? Utilities will tell you, sure, we don't mind serving this customer. We don't know how we're going to do it yet, but we'll do it in the future. So there's a lot of these uncertainties. At the end of the day, you also need to make sure, these data centers are going to be contributing meaningful benefits to the community in terms of taxes, in terms of being good neighbors with their noise. Noise pollution is a huge concern with data centers. And oftentimes they are locating near residences, near schools. creating long-term nuisances that can actually have a damaging impact on public health, not just an annoyance for the nearby neighbors. So there's a lot of questions that you need to have answers and certainty about, but then you also need to have mechanisms in place to hold them accountable. Oftentimes you hear big promises. Are they going to deliver on those promises though? And if they don't, how are they going to be held accountable? You're talking, oftentimes multi-trillion-dollar corporations that are building these data centers. They're very sophisticated. They have a lot of resources. How are you going to hold them accountable if they don't follow through on their pledges? If they're not good neighbors, do you have those mechanisms in place in advance?
And there's one more thing that I would like to add is regarding the heat island concept. I don't know if you heard about that. It's how this infrastructure creates the heat, and that's impacting the surrounding communities. So I'm still doing my research on that topic, but that's something new as well that we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely critical. Yeah, I think that's it's a new area to see the potential, to measure empirically what the impacts are. But some of the early research that I've seen this year published is saying it's actually a very material impact on the nearby areas. These data centers can have a significant impact on the temperature of the outdoor air. And that can have a huge impact on things like our agriculture.
Sure.
If temperatures are really hot overnight, that's going to, negatively impact productivity. That's just one example. Of course, it has impact on human beings as well, who are trying to live and thrive in our increasingly warm climate.
Yep.
And it promotes this maladaptive behavior to climate change in general, which is people then use air conditioning more because they're in a hotter place, and oh boy.
You get a little bit of negative
it's a
feedback.
Vicious cycle, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And often, I'm glad you brought that up, because often we think of the heat island as an urban issue, and that's been studied pretty well. We know how to cool down urban areas. We don't always do it, but we do kind of generally know how to cool them down. But the data centers, it's not only their scope and scale and amount of impervious surface area that warms up, but they're also, these ships are hot.
Yes.
And they're cooling mostly, but think about. Do you know? Actually, I don't know much about this. When they dump this valuable resource heat into the environment, do they sometimes put it in local settling ponds, local recharge zones? So you got hot water in ponds all around a property.
That's something that is still under discussion. Of course, every data center has their own particularities. So yeah, I cannot say if I had an answer to that question.
Yeah, oftentimes you're seeing is evaporative cooling. A lot of that heat is just kind of going up into the atmosphere, but depending on the local conditions, that heat can stay low to the ground, cause these heat impacts. Closed loop systems are, a bit different, but they can still, have their negative impacts, such as they use a lot more energy to run a closed loop system that doesn't use a lot of water. What does using a lot more energy have? That's a lot of indirect energy consumption associated with those offsite power plants that are energizing those facilities.
Yeah.
So Maria, has there been any evidence that we were talking about water and the fact that a lot of the water that cycles through data centers is treated almost like wastewater, right? And is managed by the water companies who deal with the wastewater management. Has there been any issues with data center effluents?
Yes, absolutely. There's a case in which the city wastewater had to stop the wastewater plant because they found this bacteria, and they did an exhaustive investigation, and they completely relate that bacteria to the data center wastewater. So they stopped the provision, they stopped serving that data center. Because they found this bacteria that was polluted the wastewater they had. And that was a pollution they had to control first in order to keep receiving water. Sure. So they stopped that, and they completely identified that the data center was the one to blame. So my concern with that is now where the data center is throwing their wastewater. If they are not given, if this wastewater plant is not given that service, right? So many questions to be asked.
They certainly are. And we've had some cases here in Indiana where there's been some pushes to basically dispose of the wastewater in drinking water reservoirs. And that I could see worlds of problems with that kind of thing. Not only the quantity of the heat issue, heat itself is a contaminant in the environment, right? Because a lot of ecosystems aren't necessarily designed for it. But the actual, chemical contaminants as well.
And if I could jump in just briefly to mention that, from a high level, I think folks should know that a lot of these data centers are getting water not from the river nearby or tapping into the aquifer. They're buying it from a municipal water utility that's already treating the water. So unlike, maybe some other uses of water, that we're talking treated water, then they're discharging that water back to that wastewater utility. At first, they're going to pre-treat it. They have a permit that they have to follow that specifies what they're taking out of the water before they send it to the utility. And as Maria was mentioning, that was the case here in this example from a metadata center in Wyoming. They did not follow their permit. They discharged that bacterium into the wastewater, and it led to a lot of damage at that utility. So there's a concern then that if, even when you have the permits, even when you have the laws, it can still lead to problems if, data centers where speed is the name of the game, they're cutting corners, they're moving fast, and maybe they're, not looking after the environment to the same extent.
And my concern with that case is where they are discharging their water.
Yes. And then, exactly. At the end of the day, where's that wastewater going?
With that bacteria.
Like you mentioned, some data centers, some proposals we've seen in Indiana, that wastewater could ultimately make its way to Eagle Creek Reservoir or another body of water where you have concerns about, what could happen from some of that waste stream.
I mean, that's a concept that maybe people aren't really familiar with. The idea that we're using finished water, meaning water that's so safe that we can drink it happily, and we're pumping it into this industrial facility to cool them off and then throwing it away. It's just, some of that is mind-boggling. So unboggle my mind a bit, please. So we've been talking a lot about the challenges of that data centers pose, and some of that's regulatory framework as challenges, but some of it is simply resource challenges. That's water's a finite resource, right? Your bank account only has so much in it. There's some transmission issues, but how can we do better? Like, I've heard these data centers that are in these Finnish cities, and they just put them under the city. The city's so cold in the winter that they use the fugitive heat from the data center to heat the city. It's part of their steam system. There's another, I believe one's being built in Lansing, Michigan. It's the same basic design. It's not underneath the city necessarily, but the water system. How can we do things better, Ben? And I'm going to ask you, Maria, too. How can we do things better? Are there technologies that the data centers just simply aren't investing in and they should?
Sure, there's some examples of things they could be doing better, but at the end of the day, I feel like a lot of these initiatives are, putting lipstick on a pig. It's kind of like trying to make a coal plant sustainable. It's like you can put the scrubbers on it, you can, do all sorts of things to make it more efficient, but at the end of the day, it's a coal plant and it's generating tons of pollution. It's a huge environmental negative, no matter what you do to it. And that's how I feel about a lot of these, especially hyperscale data centers. The scale is just literally too big to serve sustainably. The impacts are so large. Even when you're using some of the most efficient technologies, the cutting edge, most sustainable things, you're still talking about very significant negative impacts. And I think that's the way data centers, for example, a lot of them in Indiana and elsewhere, are moving towards closed loop cooling systems that we talked about in response to community concerns about all of the direct on-site water consumption with the evaporative cooling systems that many of them had been using. So they're making a good pitch about, hey, look, we're going to be withdrawing water once. It's going to be reused many times in our data center to transport heat, and we're not going to be just using it once. We're going to be using it many times, maybe for a year or longer before we need to flush and refill it. So sure, that does use a lot less on-site water. But then, as I mentioned earlier, take a lot more energy to power those cooling systems. So you have a lot more energy consumption you need to meet. So we definitely, want data centers, the ones that are built, to be powered as sustainably as possible with renewable energy, to have the smallest impact on water, to be sited in the locations that aren't water deserts, water constrained areas. We want them to be good community partners, limit their noise. All these things can mitigate some of the impacts. But at the end of the day, we still feel that there's going to be some pretty big negative impacts. And that's why we're seeing a lot of communities look at the evidence, look at the information and say, you know what, let's press the brakes on this. This doesn't make sense. Let's have a moratorium, or let's not welcome this type of development in our community because we're not seeing the trade-off being worthwhile for us.
Unless I'm going to, Maria, we chatted earlier today, but the Environmental Resilience Institute has been tracking moratoria and bans in the state of Indiana, and we're kind of a national leader in having some of these things. Ironically, a national leader, and probably as a result of having so many data center proposals for our state. Okay, so bans are one thing. Moratoria are just like, give a pause until we think this through. Is there any way you can get from that? How can we use those pauses to address some of Ben's questions? Are the mega data centers just shouldn't happen? Or shouldn't happen in that area? I mean, what information or what practices should we take? What breath should we be taking during this pause so that we get the information that the county needs?
Well, I will say that first of all, we need to understand that water doesn't work in our state borders, our county borders. So water has their own watershed, sub-watershed, and there is a carrying capacity.
Yeah.
So there is a limit for water resources, and we need to provide water resources for our communities, for other activities as well. I have experience in other regions of the world. In Asia, for example, they prioritize their communities first, agriculture second, and then the industrial third. So maybe doing certain prioritization. We need to prioritize the communities. We need to prioritize them because we are part of the community, right? So I will say that understanding how much water is available and if that availability is going to be sustained for the long term, that these facilities are going to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, water is a common good, right?
Absolutely.
It's one of these common resources that you're right, is not constrained by any state boundary you might think. There is limits, right? Water, like I said, it's regionally, it's a local issue in the sense that you can't transmit water reasonably from one state to another. It can be done. But.
And if these facilities are in the headwaters of a watershed, the impacts are not just local, but downstream as well.
Indeed.
So we need to understand the carrying capacity. We need to understand where these facilities are located within the watershed and understand how water flows in order to do the right water management plans that we need to develop.
So building on Maria's points about contamination that might result from these data centers and headwater, there's another example. I think it's the energy water nexus. You've written about this, and we're seeing some of these proposals for these larger mega data centers to have on-site diesel generation, quote unquote, backup generation. I don't believe for a second that they're planning to run those on only backup mode, but let's just pretend they do. So there's obviously air pollution. Diesel's a horrible fuel in terms of air pollution and air emissions, but they're also having to store the fuel there. And, underground storage tanks notoriously leak 100.9% of the time. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge concern. Again, each of these hyperscale data centers can have hundreds of backup diesel generators on site.
Wow.
Over 1,000 megawatts of backup diesel generators in some cases. Each of those diesel generators, yes, has their own storage tank full of diesel. So we're talking about over 1 million gallons of diesel stored on site for many of these data centers. So yes, we've already seen a track record, filings at IDEM showing spills of diesel at a data center, the Amazon data center, New Carlisle, for example.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't a huge one, but it illustrates, yes, they're already just in the filling process. Spills happen, contaminants happen, leaks happen. So that is a major concern. Not only the operating of those diesel generators leading to a lot of harmful air pollution in the community, but then, yes, having that fuel that can potentially contaminate water if it does get into the environment.
100.9%, by the way, is not a scientific term, but it's, So as we wrap up here, and we're thinking about what are some responses that could make this relationship between data centers, the environment, and communities more simpatico, more copacetic? One of them that I've heard, it revolves around having data centers pay for water monitoring and pay for water projects. And do you think that's reasonable?
Absolutely. And I think those are the agreements that communities should make with the data centers from the very beginning. So they need to be in charge of the water monitoring and the pollution as well. If they spill, polluters pay principle. They have to pay for the pollution. They have to pay for the recovery of the water. So yes, they are responsible if they are polluting the water resources.
And Ben, you are a phenomenal watchdog for data centers, and you worry about transparency. What do you think about the transparency issue when they have these commitments to monitor water?
Well, one of the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that we don't have information about what is in the discharge for data centers. What is in that waste stream? They're very secretive about what they're putting in their cooling systems, about their wastewater discharge. They're putting proprietary mixes of things, lots of stuff that shouldn't be getting into the environment, but there's also potential, heavy metals that just kind of copper, that kind of stuff that can
leak
that's
from
in the system.
metal pipes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Corrode or degrade over time and get into the water stream. So I think transparency on what is, in that wastewater stream, transparency about the consumption, how much are they actually using, when is it happening? Because some of them have hybrid systems that they're not using a lot of water for most of the year. They can use the ambient temperatures outdoors to cool. But then in the hot of summer, they're turning on the evaporative cooling element that uses a ton of water. But guess what? During those hot summer days, that's often when our water systems are already stressed. We're already, having water limitation concerns or thermal limits on discharges because it could negatively impact the aquatic life in a river or so on. So I think there's, definite need for transparency on this on multiple fronts when it comes to water and wastewater issues. And one more point I'll just add is that, these data centers need to be paying for their infrastructure and paying for it up front. We have concerns about the way, for example, the metadata center in Lebanon, Indiana, that water project is, it's over $500 million in water system upgrades that Citizens Energy is making in order to basically make a big straw from Indianapolis to send water to that data center because Lebanon doesn't have the extra water. They've already tapped out their water supplies. And as a result, they're tapping into the state revolving loan fund for water projects. And that fund is supposed to go to a lot of community water and wastewater facilities that struggle to otherwise get financing or would otherwise lead to large rate increases on residences. It's going to valuable projects like getting lead lines out, providing safe drinking water for people. They're tapping that for this one data center project. It's $500 million that's, going out of that pool of money available. So that's taking away from others, even though LEAP customers are eventually going to be paying off that loan over time. It's still an upfront cost, that, we see as an inappropriate use of that type of money.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's crazy that, that's it's Indianapolis Water Company sending water outside of Indianapolis and Marion County to be used, right? That's kind of
25 million gallons a day.
Yeah.
So it's a significant chunk.
And that's where the water management plans are so needed. We need to understand the carrying capacity. So we need to understand how water flows within the state, within the watershed, in order to make those big decisions.
And it's very hard to do in the data centers. Won't even tell you how much they're going to use.
I know.
So it can be very hard to plan for that without having a better transparency on the front end from them as well.
And whenever I hear proprietary chemicals using in a treatment, it sends shivers up my spine.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just want a little PFAS with your morning coffee? We can get you. Maria, is there an example you can give where this is done right, where a community has, through either collective voice or demands or something like that, has made an agreement with a data center that seems to work?
Yes, there is a case in Illinois in which the data center approached this community and they set the rules on how the data center will come to the community.
The community set the rules?
Yes, the community set the rules. They had to report the water withdrawal. They have to pay for any pollution if there was any pollution. They have to put nature-based solutions and green infrastructure as part of the design of the infrastructure, and they did that. And the community are receiving the benefits of the data centers. They receive the water reporting on a monthly basis. They receive benefits, economic benefits. So there is a good example of things could be done in the right way.
In the right way.
Yes.
Okay. And I love this monthly reporting because, Ben, you mentioned earlier about in the summer, for example, they have different energy and water demands than they do in the winter. One could give annual reporting and average out those things that end up that you shouldn't average, really, right?
Exactly. So a lot of this data is important on a more granular basis. Things like your water system's peak capacity, your energy system peak capacity. These are very time-dependent measures that's very important to plan around. And if you just have an annual average, you might be missing a lot of that important detail.
It's an age-old statistical trick.
That's right.
It works every time. Well, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to thank the Nina Mason Pulliam Charitable Trust for making this season of The Collective Tap possible. You can find us online at thecollectivetap.com. That's all one word, thecollectivetap.com, and on Facebook and Instagram. We hope you find the series illuminating and look forward to bringing you more conversations about water. Thank you for listening.